Hi there, and welcome to the Skylight Books author reading series. If you'd like to learn more about us and our many upcoming author events, please visit skylightbooks.com, where you can browse our inventory, buy books, and join our Friends with Benefits Club. You can also follow us on Twitter, Tumblr, and Facebook. To speak to a real live bookseller like me, please call 323-660-1175. Thanks for your support, and enjoy.
Before I begin, I want to do as Native people do by acknowledging that we are in the traditional territories of the Tongva people, Tongva Gabrielino people. This is their homeland that we are all guests to. And also, it's kind of my hometown. I grew up in this, I was born and raised in Los Angeles. So even though I have lived away for a long time, this is still sort of my old stomping grounds. I grew up just a few miles up the road in Eagle Rock and then earlier in East LA. So I'm glad to be here. And I'm going to just go ahead and just launch into the subject of this book. So this book comes out of what scholars and activists call environmental justice. And environmental justice is not, it's not always really understood by people. What we mean when we say environmental justice, sometimes it's taken to mean that it's justice for the environment, right? That as activists we are working to protect the environment, and that's what justice is. And in some ways it can be thought of that, but when we talk about environmental justice, it really it encompasses sort of a broad suite of things that include theory, it includes activism, it includes praxis, it includes academia. So it's discourse and it's law and policy. It's all of these things. And so I came to this work because as an undergrad in American Indian Studies, I had come before that as a kind of in the streets activist working on Native issues. I had always been drawn to environmental issues, and it's natural for those two kinds of topics to go together, especially when you're Native and you're looking at colonization and processes of dispossession and those kinds of things. So so I'd encountered environmental justice courses as an undergrad in my major of American Indian Studies, and it was really glaringly obvious how the literature about environmental justice relative to Native peoples just wasn't there. I mean, it's almost a non-existent body of literature that is explicitly about environmental justice relative to Indigenous issues. Not that there's not a lot of material about environmentalism and how it relates to Native people. There is. But this very explicit and specific terrain of environmental justice as it's conceived in policy and law relative to Native people is really not there. And so one of the things that I was really drawn to, and as I noticed through my years studying it, was the concept of sacred sites and how Native American sacred sites are so endangered, and these fights to protect these sites, and it's really particular here to Southern California, is about, they've been fought as religious freedom battles for under the American Indian Religious Freedom Act, and that law is really not adequate. It's what they call a toothless law. It doesn't really provide protections for places. It provides limited protection for access to places, but not for the places themselves. So in other words, in a place like this where development is rampant, there really is very little kinds of legal frameworks that protect sites that are being swallowed up by development, which is pretty much the biggest issue that happens in Southern California, especially in the coastal areas. So So environmental justice, my goal, as I was studying it, I came to see how the concept of environmental justice, which is, it doesn't even become articulated until about the 1980s in the United States. And it starts in the Deep South in black communities protecting themselves from toxic waste facilities. The first studies about environmental injustice came out of those communities. And some of the other battles that were being fought even before that come out of California, with some of the farm workers organizing, like in the 60s under Cesar Chavez, fighting to protect people against toxic insecticide use. So that is part of these environmental justice background battles as well. But and so as the studies evolved through the 80s, because that's really when it begins, is in the 1980s, as these studies evolve, they come to suspect that so what it looks like is that people of color, communities of color, suspect that they're being targeted for toxic development, waste, PCB incinerators, other kinds of heavy industrial kinds of facilities that expose communities disproportionately to these health-threatening kinds of processes. And these kinds of facilities disproportionately affect these communities, poor and communities of color. And so the studies decidedly looked at whether or not that was actually happening, and it turns out that the evidence was true. It showed that there was such a thing as this disproportionate targeting of communities of color. And so they came up with this concept called environmental racism. So it was a form of racism that was in a way even predictable, that these communities that were not just poor but of color would be targeted at some point for some kinds of noxious facilities. So it becomes codified in 1992 under President Bill Clinton by an executive order called Executive Order 12898, and it defines what environmental justice is. And environmental justice then becomes part of the policy background for the Environmental Protection Agency. And the Environmental Protection Agency comes to be the cornerstone, or the kind of the arbiter of environmental justice policy in the country. And then what few laws evolved to codify law that protects communities of color. So it's a pretty complex terrain. But what I noticed in the literature was that there was more and more kinds of studies coming out that were case studies about how communities of color were protecting themselves, how they were using these executive order and other policy statements to protect themselves. But the concept of environmental racism is, I contend, is too limited for Indigenous people, because the definition of environmental justice uses language that talks about ethnic minorities, and that they shall not be treated like, I'd have to look at the language, but it's about, it collapses all communities of color into one category, and without regard to race and national origin, this kinds of language. But for Native people, and this is one of the core points that this book makes, is that Native people are not just ethnic minorities in this country. Native people are nations, and they are subject to a completely different kind of legal regime. They have completely different histories, and they have completely different relationships to land. because of their, long-standing tenure, obviously, in place. And their worldviews and how they relate to the land is completely different. And they have, these different relationships construct this, what we would call sacred sites today that we're trying to, that they are working really hard to protect. And as I talk about in the book, Standing Rock, the No Dapple fight that happened, starting in 2016 was really a foundational example of how this plays out. How even though the Standing Rock Sioux are a federally recognized tribe with treaty protections, the land that pipeline was going through was outside reservation boundaries, even though it had treaty protections associated with it. But that the law, even the laws that protect the treaty rights, were not strong enough to protect that land from this pipeline from going through and under the lake, which was really the crux of the problem for the tribe. It was about protecting the water. So like thinking through, like, what does environmental justice mean for tribal people when tribes have reservations? Okay, reservations are called trust lands. Those lands are protected by a completely different legal regime. And so those are battles that enjoin self-determination. So those are sovereignty matters. And those are pretty strong laws and frameworks that they can use to protect, because they have the say for what happens within those boundaries. It's outside the boundaries that are the problem. And even with, again, these treaty relationships and these treaty protections, what does it mean to have those laws and still have these sites be violated in all kinds of different ways and not have those kinds of protections, and how can they be protected? So these are the kinds of things that this book looks at. What it does is it posits an indigenized view of environmental justice. It says that for indigenous peoples, that framework of environmental justice that collapses all ethnic minorities into one group is not enough. It doesn't work. And so it's the foundation. It's a conversation. This book is a conversation to take into government spaces, into activist spaces, to understand that there needs to be a different language and a different way of looking at what environmental justice is for indigenous peoples. So that's kind of the foundation of where this book starts. And what it does, I'm going to just kind of give you a chapter rundown. So it starts by looking at Standing Rock and talking about how Standing Rock started, what it was all about, and why Standing Rock was an environmental injustice for the Standing Rock Sioux people. The second chapter goes into environmental justice theory and breaks it down to talk about what environmental injustice, what the limitations are of environmental justice theory for indigenous peoples and why it doesn't work. That goes into a conversation about genocide. So it's really having to look at a deep history, or take a deep look into the history of settler colonialism, and settler colonialism as a process of genocide, and settler colonialism as a process of environmental injustice. So environmental injustice for Native people is not just about protecting themselves from toxic industry. It's about how genocide was enacted as this process that continually reinscribes itself in the land and the politics, and in a way that ongoingly dispossesses Native people of their lands and their nations. It's pretty deep stuff, and so I do the best I can to make this understandable, because it's pretty deep into law and history. But understanding settler colonialism as this system, as a structure that constructs the relationship between the federal government and tribal nations, that is always working against them, always eliminating them on some level, which is a process of genocide. Okay, so then I look at the history of Western expansion and the Industrial Revolution, and how, we have this narrative in the United States, kind of the mainstream historical narrative is about, progress, that the United States as this exceptional place was built on this progress, technological innovation, and, we sort of conquered nature. And at the root of that is this worldview of conquering and domination. It's a worldview built on a paradigm of dominating of the natural world, and we can take that all the way back to Christianity and the Book of Genesis and God's command to basically take over, right? I can't remember the word that it says, to dominion, to take dominion over the animals and everything. So there's like this, it's deeply embedded into this Christian settler consciousness. So deconstructing that and understanding how we get to this point where we're at in our world now, where we have nothing, where we have relentless development, capitalist-driven imperative based on limitless growth. And we can see now the effects of that. We see the effects of limitless growth, especially based on a fossil fuel economy that is basically leading to the demise of, well, not just the human race, but we know now that 60% of life that was on the planet is gone, right? Just in the last 50 years. I guess the sixth mass extinction event is happening. 60% of the world's natural diversity is already gone. So it's a pretty stark and harsh reality. Okay, so I look at the history of food systems and water systems and American Indian health, and how this process of genocide through land dispossession has left lasting, enduring impacts on Indian health through being cut off from their traditional foods. And the things that, and water too. So all of these things, native life is impacted. There's no aspect of native life that's not impacted through this history of settler colonialism. And then I look at the history of the environmental movement, and this is a deep history looking at how the environmental movement comes out of the preservation and conservation movement, and early conservationists, including Ralph Waldo Emerson, but more particularly Henry David Thoreau and John Muir, and how this era, starting in like the 1870s with the forming of the National Park Service and the creation of this conversation about conservation and wilderness, preservation of wilderness. This is a social construct. How we understand wilderness is a social construct that becomes narrated in that era, especially in the 1870s. And looking at the history of that and how this is deeply tied to the history of dispossession of Indigenous people and their lands. So that implicates, to talk about that is to talk about white supremacy. It's how white supremacy constructs American life in these ways that you don't normally think of. And then I talk about the history of Native activism and how it's always been tied to land, but specifically how with women and how women have always been central to those battles and those actions. Native women, or in Native cultures, gender relationships have always been equitable. At least pre-contact, they were inherently gender equitable societies, gender balanced. Native women never had to fight for rights in the same way that white women had to fight for rights in this country, because there was, by and large, not a reality of exploitation, right, and of imbalance, of patriarchy. And so there's that's all tied to Standing Rock, because Standing Rock, of course, is a women-led movement that comes on the heels of the Idle No More movement, and it goes back to really the 1970s with the Indian self-determination movement, and how environmental activism was a very integral part of that organizing back in those days, that activism. And then there's a whole section on sacred sites and what sacred sites and environmental justice have to do with each other, and how we need to shift our awareness and our narratives on it so that that can be worked into law and policy. And then the final chapter looks forward to, it takes a look at how productive partnerships are being formed and being used in different kinds of innovative land use arrangements in things like land conservancies and conservation easements, and the way environmentalists are finally now not working against Indian country so much like they used to, but how they're finally starting to work more in partnership with Indian country. And that's a pretty new thing, and that doesn't really start until the 1990s, about like the late 1990s. But the premise is that in order to fight the kinds of battles that we have to fight against this fossil fuel economy, it's got to be in solidarity between very diverse communities that aren't necessarily used to working together, because we're all fighting these battles, and these are existential battles now. Those of us who are paying attention get it. And so that's where this is all going. So I thought I'd read from the section on the environmental movement, kind of some of the history of the environmental movement. Some of the more provocative sections of this book, but I think I'll just start there. So this is a chapter called Not So Strange Bedfellows, Indian Country's Ambivalent Relationship with the Environmental Movement. And this section is called White Supremacy and the Seeds of the Environmental Movement. Few terms in American vernacular English can elicit the kind of emotionally charged response that white supremacy can, quote unquote, white supremacy. Americans like to think that since the Civil Rights era, we have achieved the post-racial meritocratic, that word, multicultural state where colorblindness and equal opportunity prevails. Both liberals and conservatives like to think that racism is defined only by hostile behavior from which individuals can excuse themselves because they have friends, employees, perhaps an old lover or two, who are people of color. In this way of thinking, white supremacy is an ideology restricted only to rogue alt-right neo-Nazis or white nationalist fringe groups, and certainly not well-meaning everyday people, whether conservative or liberal. While white supremacy is most definitely at the root of these regressive social movements, as a foundational worldview constructed by centuries of white European settlement of the United States, it is far broader than that. It is the thread from which the American social fabric is woven. A few decades of laws promoting racial justice have failed to unravel the systemic forms that white supremacy has taken, reflected by a range of social indicators from chronic wealth inequality to negative educational outcomes to disproportionate rates of violence, police, sexual, and domestic violence, and incarceration in communities of color. Centuries of dehumanization of American Indians, African Americans, and ethnic minority others has left its mark on the American mind and in its institutions refusing to die. In Indian country, white supremacy was never limited to just racial inferiority, since ideologies of religious and cultural inadequacy predated it, as the previous discussion on the foundations of federal Indian law, particularly the doctrine of Christian discovery, revealed. So the doctrine of Christian discovery is, anybody here heard of the doctrine of discovery, know what that is? So it's the foundation of federal Indian law, and it was articulated, first articulated by the Supreme Court in 1823. It's the first legal case ever argued before the Supreme Court. And it's a time when the country is on its westward march. It's just before the Indian removal. Well, the removals are already happening. They're in Georgia. The Cherokees, the 5 civilized tribes, like the Cherokee, the Choctaw, Chickasaw, Creek, and others are being pressured out of their lands by this fast-growing settler population, and so there's pressure on the Supreme Court to articulate just what land title is in the United States, and so this particular case is an effort to create that conversation and to codify it into law, and so. The court decides, it articulates this concept called the doctrine of discovery, which basically means that conquest based on the religious superiority of white Europeans, they don't say white, so it's not about race, it's about religion at this point. It's about religious and cultural superiority of Europeans, effectively granted the right of Europeans to push Indians off their lands. It's this rationalization, this legal legitimization for colonial domination and forced removal. So this is the concept that is at the foundation of federal Indian law today. It's still in existence. The entire foundation, legal foundation, is still built on it. So it's a problem. Okay. That Native people were inferior to white Europeans was a given and widely accepted by the general public well before and after the 19th century. It was as true for John Muir as it was for his predecessor, Henry David Thoreau. Some writers claim that Muir's racist views, and Muir is like famously racist, that his racist views on Indians stemmed from his post-immigration childhood in Wisconsin's Winnebago Territory and became intensified after coming to California. When Muir arrived in San Francisco in 1868, California was engaged in an open campaign of extermination of California Indians, which he didn't seem to ever have actively opposed. Instrumental in the creation of Yosemite National Park, he supported the expulsion of the Yosemite Indians from their ancient home in the valley and journaled his experiences with and thoughts about the California Digger Indians, a derogatory term even then, whom he found dirty, lazy, ugly, and altogether disappointing. Muir's apologists like to point out that his views about Indians evolved over time, especially after his travels to Alaska, where he spent time among Tlingits and other Alaska and Pacific Northwest natives, gradually growing more favorable ideas about indigenous peoples. It's true that his opinions improved over time, but Muir never really fully shed his views of indigenous inferiority that were shaped by his religious upbringings. In Alaska Natives, he may have been more able to see a noble culture that lived in harmony with its environment But even in this case, he never transcended a deeply ingrained pattern of Christian paternalism that presupposed natives as culturally deficient and in need of Christian improvement. At a time of profound oppression of native people, Muir's evolution can be said to have risen to no more than old-fashioned European benevolent supremacy. The idea of wilderness as conceived by preservationists and conservationists was a white settler social construct. It imagined an unpeopled, wild landscape as pristine, pure, and unspoiled, and as the environmental historian Carolyn Merchant asserts, reflected values that equated wilderness with whiteness, and after postbellum black urban migration, cities with darkness and depravity. These tropes, rooted in policies of removal and segregation, she argues, led to the ideal of an American colonized Eden, a controlled, managed garden from which colonized indigenous peoples, immigrants, and peoples of color were systematically excluded, and which led to patterns of toxic waste dumping in communities of color. It's against this backdrop that the Sierra Club, the United States' first non-governmental, environmentally focused organization, was founded in 1892, with John Muir at its helm as one of its founding members and first elected president. Established initially as a mountaineering enthusiast club, its mission was to explore, enjoy, and render accessible the mountain regions of the Pacific Coast, to publish authentic information concerning them, and to enlist the support and cooperation of the people and government in preserving the forests and other natural features of the Sierra Nevada. From its inception, the Sierra Club's agenda was to protect Northern California's wilderness areas, which by then had been largely cleared of California's indigenous population, with the survivors of the state's genocidal policies confined to small rancherias and reservations. It also dovetailed with the federal policy of forced assimilation legislation by the 1987 Dawes Act in the immediate post-Indian War period. Nationwide, the Indian population at record low numbers, safely contained within reservation boundaries and guarded by strictly enforced laws against hunting outside those bounds, the stage was set for a burgeoning new phase aimed at protecting what remained of the United States' wild places and animals. On the heels of the Industrial Revolution and Western expansion, and with the still growing national infrastructure, protecting the environment, framed as preservation and conservation, would be a matter of balancing the needs of development with wise use of land and natural resources. The first few decades of the 20th century saw the establishment of numerous non-governmental organizations and governmental agencies and laws oriented toward preservation and conservation. Among them are the National Audubon Society, 1905, the Antiquities Act, 1906, National Park Service, 1916, National Parks Conservation Association, 1919, Isaac Walton League, 1922, the Wilderness Society, 1922, the Civilian Conservation Corps, 1933, the National Wildlife Federation, 1936, the Defenders of the Wildlife, 1947, and the Nature Conservancy in 1951. While naturalists worked to protect lands acquired through centuries of aggressively imposed treaties and a variety of other legally sanctioned land grabs, tribes struggled to hold on to what remained of their land bases and cultures. By 1934, with the passage of the Wheeler-Howard Act, a new policy direction was ushered in, influenced by a new generation of Western-educated Indians. Also called the Indian Reorganization Act, or the Indian New Deal, the law allowed tribes to organize their own tribal governments, patterned after the U.S. Constitution. It reversed the assimilation policy and empowered newly reconstituted tribal governments to have greater management of their own land and mineral rights, still, however, under the close supervision of the Bureau of Indian Affairs, building capacity for economic development as the answer to intractable poverty that choked tribal communities. Let's see. So that gives a kind of a kind of a feel for what was happening at this time. And in the section prior to this in the book, I talk about I think I'll read from that section. I think this is pretty good. This really is sort of an interrogation of how the United States comes to understand the concept of wilderness, and indigenous people and their relationship to it. If anyone were to be called the patron saint of the environmental movement, it would surely be Thoreau. Although he was not widely read in his time, the real impact of his work would manifest later, particularly as a result of his and Emerson's influence on John Muir. Both Thoreau's and Muir's views on nature and what humans' relationship to it ought to be were shaped by their experience with Indians, about whom both wrote in published and unpublished manuscripts. Biographers of Thoreau and Muir tend to admire Thoreau and Muir's views on American Indians, praising them as progressive Indianists at a time of intensifying violent colonization of the continent, but also tend to downplay to the extent to which both men were influenced by popular anthropological narratives of Indian inferiority, what we today call the savage and noble savage tropes. In the process, these commentators often reinforced the patronizing, romanticized views that prevented Americans from seeing Native peoples as fully human in the first place. The overly romantic and fetishized views of Indian closeness with nature, conceived, for example, as the mystical, primeval, and primal Indian, inevitably invokes Indians as childlike and intellectually unevolved. Worse, it evades U.S. accountability for its genocidal expropriation of the continent based on the very justification of Indian inferiority and the violation of its own constitutional law about treaties being the supreme law of the land. Thoreau especially wrote extensively about American Indians. Fascinated by Indians' closeness to nature, he studied their history and cultures, and later in his life befriended Penobscot's Joe Aitteon and Joe Police, whom he had hired as guides, documenting his adventures with them in his classic work, The Maine Woods. He clearly had a great admiration for the way Indians lived, and he perceived in their spirituality a mysticism that appealed to his own transcendentalist orientation. Yet, inescapably woven throughout Thoreau's writings about Indians is also a romantic draw to the wildness of Indian life, the noble savagery of the Indian, who by virtue of his primitiveness is worthy of respect because, at least in part, he resists the corruption of the white man's civilization. Thoreau may have appreciated Indians more than most European Americans, but he was still a man of his times and reflected popular social Darwinist views when he wrote in 1858, "Who can doubt this essential and innate difference between man and man when he considers a whole race like the Indian, inevitably and resignedly passing away in spite of our efforts to Christianize and educate them? Individuals accept their fate and live according to it, as the Indian does. Everybody notices that the Indian retains his habits wonderfully, is still the same man that the discoverers found. The fact is, the history of the white man is a history of improvement, that of the red man a history of fixed habits of stagnation." Thoreau read Samuel George Morton's Crania America, which was published in 1839, and embraced Morton's theories of Indian cultural and intellectual lowliness, even as he occupied himself with absorbing all he could about Indian life, fixating on everything from the Indian physique to funeral customs. Thoreau seemed never to have grasped that the New England wilderness, already so altered by European settlement in his time, had in the colonial period been a cultural landscape shaped by centuries of Indian intervention on the land, not the untouched, pristine environment he and many of his contemporaries imagined. The history of national parks, shaped by ideologies of preservation and conservation that Thoreau and similar naturalists inspired, has a long track record of severing Indians from living on or traditional uses of their ancestral lands. Similar versions of the Yellowstone story played out in the early days of numerous national parks, including Glacier, Mount Rainier, Mount McKinley, now Denali, Death Valley, Grand Canyon, Mesa Verde, and many others. National park historians Keller and Michael Turek identify 4 phases the national park system exhibited as it gradually improved its relationship with tribes, particularly in the latter half of the 20th century. But by then, the stubborn narratives about Indian savagery and inferiority that justified their removal from parklands had cemented themselves into the national imagination and infiltrated the consciousness of early environmentalists. The racist tropes are found throughout the historical literature of the late 19th and early 20th centuries and are all too familiar. Indians were lazy, stupid, and childlike, conniving beggars and treacherous liars. But ironically, they were also sometimes characterized as ignorant of their own environments, wasteful users of the land. In 1923, for instance, one ranger in Glacier National Park enforcing no hunting laws, which violated the treaty rights of the Blackfeet inside the park, commented that unless the Indians are curbed in their desire to kill everything in sight, Glacier Park will soon have no game. So this whole section is talking about how native, these tropes of native inferiority and savagery were used to justify the dispossessing them of their lands. This is the history of the national park movement in this country. And it's not very well known. It's well documented, though. And part of that was about how, again, how native people were thought to not really know how to use land. But what we know now, and what Indians have always known, is how they did use land and how they managed landscapes in very specific ways, especially here in California. This is very well known. Cultural burning of the forests and pretty much everywhere they lived was practiced as a way to manage forests so that you don't have these kinds of out of control wildfires that we see now, and which are, of course, are exacerbated by climate change. But so part of the project of this book is to debunk those myths of Indians not knowing how to, not sort of manipulating their environments in ways that worked for humans, but also worked in ways that perpetuated the health of those environments. So I think I'm going to stop there and open it up to a conversation if there's any thoughts, questions. Yeah.
Two things occurred to me. I really liked the philosophical basis of exploitation circling around capitalism. And a lot of my friends right now are thinking of how to create sustainable markets or some sustainable system.
Yeah.
And so I'm wondering if you could review for me how, I also like the idea of Indigenous peoples having equitable gender relationship because the notion of exploitation is absent. So I'm wondering if private property can be examined in a way that would bring light to people who are trying to think of new systems that would be equitable. And then the other thing I was just so curious about how you would see the Bundy spectrum.
Huh. Yeah. A friend of mine is working on a book about that right now. Her name is Jacqueline Keeler. She's a native journalist, and she's got a book coming out any day now. I'm not sure when that's going to drop, but she compares the Bundy story to Standing Rock. So keep that in the back of your head. The Bundy thing was of course incredibly problematic. In terms of private property, private property really is the root of the problem, right? I mean, private property is at the foundation of capitalism. The privatization of property, tying it to concepts of value of economic value, and it's what was used to continually dispossess natives of their land. It was at the core of the assimilation process. So once the United States, in its project to dominate Native people legally and politically, once that became complete in Indian law, through beginning with the 1823 decision that I talked about with the Doctrine of Discovery, that gets woven into the entire legal regime, and different policies that enact them, so that the United States government enacts through time, are always in some way assimilationist. Even today, when we have a framework that we call self-determination and sovereignty, there's always a thread of assimilationism in there. And so this assimilationism really begins in earnest in the 1880s with the Assimilation Act, right? It was the law. It was specifically called that. And at its core, it was about taking communally held lands, tribal lands, and breaking them into individual plots in order to instill values of individualism, right, and private ownership, in order to create, and they use this language to create an ethic of selfishness, because Indian people were famously known to be not selfish. They were communal, they were collectively oriented, and that was a huge threat to the settler project. So that's part of how private property gets used really against Indian country, and I mean, looking at that is the root of the capitalist system that we're still living with. I don't know personally, and there are scholars who are doing that kind of work. Is there such a thing as sustainable capitalism? I don't know. A lot of the scholars that I'm reading, especially Indigenous scholars, say, like this idea of green capitalism, don't think so. But there are other opinions too.
Can you help me with one psychological factor of land ownership? The territorial nature of people. So I would assume all the cultures try through religions and try to negotiate this. We all have a territory, right? So can you help me think of a way of territory that is not on a land ownership system?
In an Indigenous worldview, it's about relationship to place. So Native people, even though one of the myths in the United States is about savage people fighting violent wars against each other all the time, right? That's one of the things that historically has been used to justify this violent domination of Native peoples. Well, they were killing each other anyway. That's really not so true. Yes, there were territorial conflicts. By and large, if you look at military studies show that Native peoples did not fight the types of wars that Europeans had been fighting against each other for centuries, right? Wars of complete elimination. That was a European way of war, about complete conquering. Native peoples skirmished with each other for sure, but fundamentally, straight across the board with Indigenous cultures, is a respect for territory, a respect for bounded space, for the way people live on land, because who they are fundamentally in their identities is always connected to place. Who I am as a Colville woman, connected to the Sinixt people, is about how our relationship to a place called the Arrow Lakes, is an example. our stories are connected to it. And so for Indigenous peoples, this is a common thread. Who you are, your language, your histories is all connected to these, to your roots that grow literally into the ground. And it's reflected in language, it's reflected in ceremonies, it's reflected in everything that Native people do and who they are. Like, you can't separate those things. So that, I'd say that's a way of articulating this idea of bounded space and the respect for it. I would say Europeans didn't have that. That's why you have these, the willingness to leave your home places, like you leave for whatever reasons. They left their spaces and they came to other places and invaded. They invaded on their own continent. That was going on for centuries before they came here.
It's interesting, the Mayans, these ancient civilizations really didn't start warring until so much later than the Vikings and, the land takeovers that were going on. It's interesting. And it's almost, it seems like if you study like Mayan history and the architecture and the beautiful cities, it's as if they suddenly, weirdly, oddly, somewhere late in the line, they get the idea that they can take over, and it's a weird, it's just a weird concept to the whole.
Yeah, well, I mean, it's arguably, again, it's tied to Christianity and the imperative in Christianity to go forth and multiply and take dominion over the natural world. I mean, the Cain and Abel story is a story of justification of the killing of other people to take land. Yeah.
Thank you so much for your talk. It's very enjoyable. More than enjoyable in the sense that it's informational. I come from North Carolina in a background that was very Christian, and me and my family were very racist. And I saw them construct a lot of narratives around Black people, specifically, other side of the railroad tracks kind of narratives. And then you see visual narratives. And I wanted to ask you about sort of the deconstructing of those narratives as they relate to this, and in what instances it's important to build solidarity, and in what instances it's really important to stand separate, if that makes sense. I'd like to talk about your particular experience as being individual, and talk about the specific instances of oppression and how to fight them, rather than lumping it all.
Yeah. Well, from an Indigenous perspective, it's about understanding that that Native people have political relationships to the state. And this is something that no other group in the United States can claim, right? The treaty relationships created these political relationships. And this is nation to nation. And even though it's ongoingly violated, there is still, even in this horribly problematic regime of federal Indian law, there is still the recognition of inherent sovereignty, of how treaties was ultimately a mutual recognition, a recognition of mutual sovereignty. So that's really, that does construct. So it's paradoxical, right? The relationship of tribes and the United States is paradoxical. So there's that. So there's like the relationship between tribes and the states. Then there's relationships between what we would call environmental justice communities, right? Black or ethnic minority, others. What comes to mind is that, and it's something I've been thinking about a lot, is that there's a sort of a chasm, like a breakdown between these communities. There's in sort of activist spaces, you don't see as much cross-organizing and solidarity, like for example, between the Black community and the American Indian community, they're fighting for different things in ways. Native American, Black people, for example, have been fighting for equality, right? They're fighting for racial justice and equality. They want parity with white dominant society. That's what they want. Economic equality, basically, is really how it translates to them. Native people, it's not the same thing. Native people have never fought for equality with the dominant society. Native people are fighting, they're fighting for respect, but they're not fighting to be equal to white people. They're fighting to be treated equally well, but not for political equality. And so these are different kinds of languages, and I would also go so far as to say that in this country, I think that we've, as difficult with our race relationships as it is, still is, I think that collectively we have been able to grapple with anti-Black racism easier than we've dealt with settler colonialism, right?
Settler colonialism benefits us in a lot of ways.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, that because settler colonial, I mean, we can say, oh yeah, the original sin, you hear this language, the original sin of slavery, right? Is slavery the original sin? Is it really? Right? I don't know, because invasion happened before slavery happened, right? So Black people fighting for economic equality on stolen lands is something that needs to be talked about, right? That's why these conversations of reparations have to be really carefully crafted.
Even to add to your argument, notions of debt and redemption, all of this is biblical language. Everything connected to finance comes from Christian biblical orientation. So poverty, you're already in a biblical construct. Slavery, you're already there. You
Yeah.
know,
Yeah.
you know that it's not original sin. You've got it. Yeah, totally. Yeah. I mean, it's so fascinating how these prisons get created. You know.
Could I add one?
Sure.
There's no degree to which you could expect the U.S. To violate treaties that they have created with other countries. I've just been researching the Marianas Islands recently, and the ways that the U.S. government has just completely trounced any notion of them having individualism, even though they stated as saying they want to respect them within this treaty. They say that legally, when they go to court, the judge says, well, no, there's this one line in it that gives us the right to do whatever we want with your land. How do you as an individual, one other instance of this in Texas, I forget where it was, there was some flooding that happened during heavy rain, and the floodwaters were routed to go through a Black community, and they were never notified, and they even called into the city to say, hey, are we in trouble with the water's coming this way? They said, no, you're probably fine. The city is now completely destroyed, gone. They were never able to rebuild. And so when those sorts of things happen, and from a judicial standpoint, I know it's completely different instances, what does the individual do? Like, who do I call? How do I try to hold groups accountable? What's the organization of, I mean, how do you call it? You can't really recall a naval judge, I recognize, but what can we do?
That's always the golden question, right? And there's no easy answer to it, right? I mean, you can only do what you feel called to do personally. So there's what you do on the individual level versus what we do on the societal level, right? So on the societal level, we have to be willing to deconstruct these narratives, understand the histories. How did we get here? And shift courses and build it into policy and law. That's what I'm trying to do anyway. That's why I wrote this book, because this book, it sort of changes the conversation. And that's, at least that's my hope. That's my hope, that that in time it will do that. It's like, okay, this is how we've been thinking about it, but it's not working, so we need to have a different conversation about it. How do we do it? How do we talk about, incorporate the language of settler colonialism as the structure at the at the foundation of the United States in a way that well, it's about accountability, right? I mean, it's ultimately about accountability. This country has not accounted for its intense violent history and structure. I mean, the United States is one of the most violent countries in the planet to this day, and but there's a profound denialism about that.
Or even an ability to stand outside of it to see it.
Yeah.
Maybe it takes outsider status to even see it. Or maybe the new vision has to be that we all see with different eyes, like outside eyes. I don't know.
Yeah. I know the United States doesn't like to be criticized from outsiders. We're so exceptional. Yeah.
Well, I kind of have a couple of things. One is, from what little I know, there seems to have been in the 70s real strong, or definitely stronger than maybe immediately preceding, and part of my question is, what is it in comparison to today? A sort of strong Native American self-determination movement, just generally activism that was, I mean, publicized in the media. Obviously, celebrity was there involved in, I guess, getting the word out. One is, I'm wondering, so was there any specific or set of spurs that caused that to happen? My other second part of that question is there anything comparable today? Is it happening? Is there a resurgence? I mean, because today it seems like there are a lot of there are a lot of people who are sort of, I don't know the word, I guess maybe revisiting or thinking their identities, right? There's a lot of talk about identity and where I come from, who I am, what intersectionality, all of this, right? Has that spurred a sort of resurgence in Native American activism? And then the last part of the question is about this question of solidarity between separate movements, say African Americans and Native Americans. I mean, what kind of work is or could be done to, it seems like solidarity, I mean, a unified front in some way would be a goal to.
Yeah, it definitely is. I think people are trying. I don't know that we're seeing it on a mass scale yet, like we should. But talking about you use the word resurgence of activism in American Indian communities, and to say resurgence sort of implies that activism like wasn't there before, like a lack of action. And I would argue that that's really not the case. If you look at the history of activism in Indian country, it really comes out of, on the heels of the end of the Indian Wars period. Native people start organizing in this period of forced assimilation through the Dawes Act. They get forced into the boarding schools. They start getting educated in white man's language, white man's writing, right, and law, and these kinds of systems. And so they come out of these boarding schools. They're even going to college. So they're armed with these kind of weapons, like they know the weapons of the enemy, and they start using them. And so you see the beginning of organizing Indian rights by Native people in 1911 with the beginning of the Society of American Indians. And that's all about fighting for Indian rights. And it's always about protecting land, but it's also about protecting identity and fighting against the horrible effects that these policies have had, especially poverty. So settler colonialism really is a system of imposed poverty and starvation and death. It's a system of death for Indian people. So they organize, it begins early in the 20th century and it builds. So we have changing of policy because of Native activism as a direct result of their influence on policymakers, going to Washington, D.C., fighting for different legislations and laws that will protect their rights and protect their lands and communities. And so it produces results. And the first, real change we see in 1934 with the Indian New Deal, the Indian Reorganization Act, it's a loosening of these constraints of forced assimilation, and it lasts just a few years. But by the 1940s, you start to see another policy shift happening. You start seeing during the Truman administration. Building through the 1950s as politics become more, post-war politics become more conservative. You see this narrative of the Indian problem. The Indians are still the problem that need to be solved. And so they concoct this new policy framework called termination, literally termination. And it's about terminating their existence. Again, it's just it's a genocidal policy that's designed to abdicate federal responsibility to its treaty relationship, ultimately. And so this policy, it's a forced assimilation policy like the policies from before. And so you see a new wave of activism and organizing in Indian country, and it's concurrent with the civil rights movement, right? In the 1950s, you see what's happening with African American communities and Martin Luther King organizing in the South. Indians were organizing in other places too. In the same, while Martin Luther King was organizing in Selma, Alabama, Iroquois people were fighting against a dam project in upstate New York. At the same time, the federal government was building the Pick-Sloan dam system on the Missouri River that led to the sorry state of affairs that created Standing Rock today. And they were fighting against that too. So Native people have never stopped fighting, even if people didn't, like the broader society didn't see it. It was still happening. And so by the 1960s, they were engaged in the fish wars, of course, with the help of, you mentioned the celebrity, Marlon Brando, Dick Gregory, Jane Fonda were part of that. And then that builds into, 1968 with the Alcatraz Island takeover and the American Indian movement. And this is what leads to self-determination in 1975 as a policy. So anytime there's been any kind of shift, positive policy shift in Indian country by the federal government, it's a direct result of Indian organizing and action. It's not because of the benevolence of white people.
What
Right?
about gambling?
That too. That comes out of Southern California, comes out of Morongo. Their gaming, their bingo operation, they had to fight a Supreme Court battle to protect that. And that Supreme Court battle in the 1980s results in the Indian Gaming Regulatory Act, which is about, it didn't legalize gaming. What it did was it recognized and regulated their already given right based on sovereignty to practice it.
And then the wealth creation, how has that affected the community? Is that universally good?
Wealth creation is not universal, I can tell you that. Only a very few tribes have achieved the kind of wealth that we see in Southern California. especially in San Diego. That's the exception to the rule. Of the hundreds of Indian gaming establishments across the country, very few of them produce any kind of wealth at all. So, another thing too, when you talking about wealth and relationships to land and capitalism in a fossil fuel economy. In the 1990s, we see it was not even that long ago. It was in the 2000s we see the boom of the exploitation of the Bakken oil fields, right? In the Dakotas, North Dakota, particularly, massive discovery of oil under the grounds of Fort Berthold Reservation. Southern Ute has a lot of fossil fuel resources, and they have developed, in order to escape this poverty, this intense poverty that settler colonialism imposes, aided by federal policy, people who are happy to see exploitation of fossil fuel resources, no matter who's doing it, right, Indians or whoever, they enable it. And so this has led to problems. So this is something that Indian countries having to grapple with. How do you reconcile your worldviews about sanctity of land and place, protecting your homelands, with the inevitably toxifying effects of fossil fuel development? And they're having a hard time. It's contributed to the problem we've been hearing a lot about, missing and murdered Indigenous women, right? That's a thing now, right? Indian country's known it for a long time, but now the mainstream media has picked up on it. We're finally seeing some action in Congress about it. But it's exacerbated by the fossil fuel industry in some places, like Fort Berthold with the man camps. And the same thing is true in Canada.
Big problem in Canada that they basically, you'd think Canada would have a better track record than the U.S. does, but they're basically the same as us.
Yeah, but they were on it earlier. They at least started the studies earlier than what happened now. They knew, they were willing to at least talk about it, and it's partly because of their truth and reconciliation process.
Don't they also have, every time they gather in assembly, they acknowledge the land where they're, is that?
Land acknowledgement.
Yeah,
Yeah,
I love that.
yeah. It's not law. It's not written into law, but it's become protocol.
It's so lovely.
It's lovely, but it's the danger of it is that it's sort of shallow, and it's been criticized that way. It's nice that Trudeau, will do a land acknowledgement, and he's got this pro-Indian kind of on the surface agenda, but at the same time he's pushing pipelines, he's violating laws that protect Indigenous people, and no different than Harper before him. So yeah.
But it's good, the conversation, that the minds are melting,
Yeah. I'm not going to deny that. It's we can have conversations about this, but it's never enough, and it's never.
It's not action.
Yeah, and it's not action. Any other thoughts? We're trying to be mindful of the time. Christina. No, go.
Well, thank you so much for talking. It's really interesting to do the discussion as well. And I just had a quick question to follow up kind of about what folks were saying around the specific role of militarization of Indian countries in relation to environmental injustice, and kind of where that might be at now in terms of the environmental movements or Indigenous folks, considering the military is
Yeah, I didn't really, in this study, I didn't really look at that. I mean, that would be a pretty probably specific kind of area of focus. And I mean, you probably would know as well as I do about the literature or lack of around that. So yeah, I don't think I can really speak to that. Christina is a friend of mine. We're colleagues in grad school. That's how we know each other. And she was generously read chapter drafts of this book. So she gets a shout out in the acknowledgments.
That was so interesting. Thank you for teaching us so much new stuff. It's really timely material you're sharing. So people pick up.
Yeah, well, we hope so. I mean, these are crucial conversations. I mean, the ship's going down, right? And we're all going down with it unless we fight really hard.
The one place we'll all be equal is the destruction of this
Yeah.
planet.
Yeah, pretty much. I mean, we can't afford not to fight together anymore.
Well, thank you.
You've been listening to the Skylight Books author reading series. Don't forget, you can listen to this and all of our other great podcasts at skylightbooks.com. Thanks again for stopping by, and we hope to see you soon.